as to how they refer to Mary as the Virgin, the Virgin, the Virgin. They just keep on referring to, they don't even say Mary, they say the Virgin. Well, of course, that comes from a Catholic concept that Mary was a perpetual virgin, but of course that's ludicrous because of so many different observations relative to the other children that she had, that Jesus had half-brothers and half-sisters, and anyhow, that's a whole nother matter. But the question was right here in verse number 3, when Mary said, you got to do something, Jesus. And so, remember here in verse 2, she says, they have no wine, to Jesus. Jesus says, woman, what have I to do with thee? Mine hour is not yet come. Now, of course, as is the case with any little section of Scripture like that, you have to consider the context as well. By this period of time, Jesus is at least how old? He's 30. He's got to be at least 30. So, I know it's hard for us to imagine a mama still sticking her nose in the business of a 30-year-old son, but we know that happens today, don't they? So even if we looked at it from the standpoint of mama, come on now, you got to cut the apron strings at some point in time here, But at the same time, while we would look at that as being she's being jumped on by Jesus, that's not the case at all. And one of the things that might throw us off and make us assume that to be the case, and keep in mind, before we assume something to be so, then that's got to be the only way it can be looked at. And if there are other ways to look at it, and if there are other ways to look even at the word that he uses here to describe Mary as woman, then we've got something to talk about then, see. If there's other ways that it can be taken other than what we jump to the conclusion that he's saying, okay? So it's interesting that Syrophoenician woman, Jesus addressed her as woman. Mary Magdalene, he addressed her as woman. When Jesus was hanging on the cross, and there was his mother, and of course him giving the overseership of his mother to John, he said woman. So instead of it being the absence of an endearing term, it was a term that Jesus oftentimes used anyhow. And at the same time, think about it from a practical standpoint. Some have said, well, in order for them to be at this wedding anyhow, that pretty well means, or at least it's a possibility, that they were, at least Mary was a part of the family that this wedding is taking place at. It may be extended kinfolks somehow, okay? And so whose job is it to make sure that the host have all that they need? Well, it's the family. And so maybe here Mary is trying to jump in here and save from a terrible situation in which they ain't got enough drinks to drink, and so she interjects herself into there without letting the actual host of the wedding feast take their proper position and take care of the matter themselves. And then, of course, what really lets us see a little bit clearer is what he says after he says that. Woman, what have that to do with thee? Are you going to try to force me into demonstrating my deity right here at this wedding feast? Instead of being patient, I saw someone that translated it, woman, don't be so anxious. Don't be so on your toes and wanting to jump in and help. And, of course, we've asked the question before, how would she know that he had the ability to perform miracles anyhow? If this is the first public miracle that was performed, then how does she know that he can do anything about it? Is he just a great fella at being able to figure out everything that happens, and so he's a jack of all trades, and so she's putting him to the task of do something, son? Well, we don't know. But instead of looking at it as a rebuke of his mama and saying, Mom, you know what you're talking about? No, don't jump to that conclusion. And of course, we want to think that this was something that Jesus did in the presence of everybody. Well, what have I got to do with you? Don't you know my time ain't come? And he announces that at the wedding feast. Well, that's not indicated here either. It's a personal reply to her question, her desire. And so far from it being a bad thing, and of course, this is not the only time that happened. I mean, there's different times in which interaction between Jesus. Now, we can understand, think back when he was 12 years old, back there in Luke chapter 2. Luke chapter 1. Anyhow, way back there. Then, on that occasion, said, "Wished you not that it ought to be about my Father's business? What have you done, son? We're scared to death something happened to you. We thought you was with the family." And, of course, that's a possibility. He could have been. But, why were they not aware of where Jesus actually was, 12-year-old boy? And now, all of a sudden, when he's lost, then they got to run back to the temple and find him there discussing matters with the doctors of the law at the temple. So there again, he doesn't say, I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And here it's almost, you're wanting me to do something that may not necessarily be on God's timetable. But, of course, it all works out for good. It all demonstrates the power of God through Jesus on this occasion. And what was needed was provided, which demonstrated that he, in fact, is deity, or at least he's got connection with deity, because nobody can perform a miracle or supernatural event like this except God be with him. So there's some other possibilities there. And then there's still others who would say, I don't care, it seems awful mean to me. I don't know what else I can do for you. That's about all that I can say on the matter. Has anybody got any comments, questions, preferably comments on this particular issue? Yeah, she knew that he had the power to fix the problem, and simply told the people who would be responsible for doing all the manual labor to make it possible for him to do what he's fixing to do. Says, whatever he tells you to do it. So that could be an indication. Here's a young man who's demonstrating himself, 30 years old. That's a little bit more than a young man, but 30 years old, he's demonstrated himself to be a dependable fella, and I've never seen him in a type where he didn't have a way to answer the problem. And it may not have, it very likely was not something of a supernatural matter before, but certainly on this occasion it had to be. And thus, Jesus performed that first miracle in Cana of Galilee. Anything else? Yes, exactly. I mean, the thing when he's able to look into the heart of Nathanael earlier in John chapter 1, then that is a miraculous event. Remember, Philip, back in chapter 1 at verse 45, Philip found Nathanael and said unto him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and the prophets write, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." And Nathanael said, "Can any good thing come out of Nazareth?" And then in verse 47, Jesus said, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom is no guile." Now, what is he demonstrating the miraculous ability to do right there? He knows the heart of this fellow. Now, is that natural? Absolutely. He's able to know the heart of this fellow. So that's a miraculous thing. And, of course, we have it recorded here where he's able to do that. And the thing is, sometimes we say, boy, if we had a little bit more information about all of what he did during those years that are not recorded for us, between 12 and 30, if we had all that. I mean, we've got enough speculation and things to keep us busy with what we got. Why would we want to have more? It's not going to contradict anything that we have. We know we have the completed revelation of God and man in what we have. So if this is enough to keep us so busy we'll never get caught up, then why would we want anything else? And I realize people want other questions answered. This would clear it up for me. That's one of the first things I'm going to ask Paul when I get to heaven, or Jesus. Yes, Sarah? Exactly. And we would do well to determine what all is involved in that we have a say-so about, and do it. Now, as it comes to getting taller and fatter, we have just a little bit to do with that, But there is genetic makeup that's going to take care of whether you're taller or wider or whatever, and you can go against that for a little while, and you can starve yourself to death and all that. But increasing in wisdom and in stature and favor with God and man, wisdom, we can do that ourselves. We can assist in that for sure. And in favor with God and man, you got to work at all that. It's not something just naturally happens. That has to be a determination on the part of all of us. So I guess you could say 70% of the things that Jesus did that was within his control and his volition, those fit into the same category with us as well, to grow like that, whether it be from 12 to 30 or 30 to 100 or 101, as is the case with Sarah. Then we ought to be busy doing that for sure. All right, our next situation here we're going to look at is going to be located in a particular locality here, and I've got off base here, Luke chapter 17. You got your Bibles handy in Luke chapter 17 is where we're going to be studying. And this is just a big picture of you can see here on the map the general Middle East. This is around the time of the patriarchs, so it's a little bit before there was any such thing as a big city in Jerusalem and all that, but nonetheless. And then we go a little bit, there's where we're talking about, in where this right here actually takes place. So the cities that are going to be prominent in where these events take place, of course, is Cana in Galilee. You can notice there's province up here, division of Galilee. And, well, I've actually got, there's Galilee. And then you got Samaria, and then you got Jerusalem. And what we're introduced to here at the beginning is that here's Jesus who is making his way to Jerusalem. And so if he's traveling south, going to Jerusalem, then here's localities he's going to be going through, okay? And it just so happens that one of these localities in his traveling that they come upon some individuals who are beset with a terrible, terrible disease, a terminal illness called leprosy. And we're going to look at that. But here's something I want us to think about before that. You've heard people say, I know when Daniel's talked to us about how to read the Bible, how to study the Bible, especially as it relates to an epistle. I mean, obviously the best way to go about studying the epistle is to read the epistle, Instead of hopping over there in chapter 3 of 2 Thessalonians, then you start and read the whole epistle, and so you got the whole context of the epistle. Might I also suggest that when it comes to the historical records provided for us by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that we try to do the same thing. Somebody says, well, that's a whole lot of material. Well, it sure is, but the main point is that when we look at anything, anywhere in the Bible, then we have to take into consideration heavily the context. Where is this coming from? Who's doing the speaking? Who is he speaking to? And of course, when you're figuring out things like that, then you're also figuring out who's not being spoken of, who's not being spoken to, who's not doing the speaking. This is what area is not hearing what's being said. And so it happens that here in the midst of this passage we're going to be looking at, it's found in a context that goes all the way back to, prior to chapter 16, of course. It goes back, the context goes all the way back prior to the unjust steward in the first 12 verses of Luke chapter 16. The context is the same in which we read about the rich man and Lazarus in the last part of Luke chapter 16. And so we've got to keep all that context in mind. And especially I want us to look at, even before we start reading here, because here is something that takes place that is the backdrop. And this is the backdrop for the miracle that's performed. And you wouldn't even, if you were not made aware that these were connected together, then you would never realize they're connected together. Keep in mind, back here in chapter 17, verse 1, it is impossible, but offenses will come, but woe unto him through whom they come. So he's talking about here occasions of stumbling, or people who are responsible for putting obstacles in the path of others. So keep that in mind. And that comes on the heels of what we just got through reading, rich man, Lazarus, unjust steward, and all like that. They're all connected together. And the central theme over which they're linked together, believe it or not, has to do with forgiveness. Not only on the receiving end, but also on the giving end of forgiveness. So I said, well, how does that all fit together? Well, just as God intended it for it to. Now, see, the problem is sometimes we'll take something out of its context and we'll give it a setting or give it an application that was never intended. Now, sometimes it doesn't do any harm to the text to do so, but sometimes it misses the point entirely. Sometimes that's not at all what Jesus is talking about. And that would be clear if we just looked and made careful use of the context. So here at the beginning of chapter 17, on the heels of rich man and Lazarus, notice he's talking about causing other people to stumble, causing other people to fall. So look again, beginning at verse 2. It is better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck and he be cast into the sea than that he should offend one of these little ones. Now very quickly we can sort of boil that down to, it'd be better to be dead than to cause somebody to lose their salvation through being an offense or a stone of stumbling. That's pretty severe, isn't it? That's what Jesus said. If we would get in the way of the spiritual well-being of somebody else, and of course here he's talking primarily using the example of the Pharisees, and those who would be childlike or more innocent and gullible would be the tax collectors and the prostitutes. Now, obviously, it would have reference as well to a new Christian. And, of course, we could say that a child in a general way would fit in that category. But the context is more with somebody that's new in the faith, somebody that's just learning the truth, as was the case when Jesus was spending time with the tax collectors and the prostitutes. And, of course, remember, the Pharisee says, we don't have any need of a physician. We're as well as can be well. Well, of course, they were blind to the fact that they were in worse need than these other two that they looked upon as being trash. They all had a soul. And it just so happened the common people, which included tax collectors and prostitutes, were more open and receptive to what Jesus had to say than the Pharisees, than the religious leaders of the Jews. So now that's not to say that we could not find ourselves fitting into the category of the Pharisees and the condemnation that's said here, but that's a general application of what Jesus is talking about here. Certainly, anyone who finds himself impeding the progress of a new convert or a person who's young in the faith or a person who's seeking to be a follower of Jesus, be better off to be dead than cause that to happen. And I didn't say that. Jesus said that. Sounds like something to be real careful, make sure we're not guilty of doing it. And interestingly, as we'll see here in this particular lesson, it also has application of that being a failure to forgive. You mean a rock of offense, something that could cause somebody else to stumble, is a refusal to forgive somebody who wants to be forgiven? That's what Jesus is saying right here. Because what is happening in that situation? Well, you're modeling, as a person who's supposed to know better, you're modeling an attitude that's the exact opposite of the attitude of Jesus. So how could that be beneficial? Well, it couldn't be. And so he continues there, notice dealing with the same topic, verse 3, take heed to yourselves. If your brother trespass against thee, rebuke him. If he repent, forgive him. And if he trespass against thee 7 times in a day, and 7 times in a day he turns again saying, I repent, thou shalt forgive him. Same context. Now, somebody says, well, this is just hyperbole. This is facetious. Well, no, not really, because he's talking about what our attitude ought to be, which is the attitude that Jesus possesses, the attitude that God possesses. Somebody says, well, how in the world will we think that in a single day, here's a person who's going to commit the same sin against us, and then every time we call him on it and he repents, then, well, no, there's nothing to indicate here that he's talking about one day, nor is he talking about it being the same sin that's being committed over and over and over again. I would stand to reason that if somebody's doing the exact same thing and asking for repentance about the same exact sin on the same day, maybe they are not being honest. Wouldn't you? Maybe they're just flapping their jaws together, but they're not serious about what they're saying. And when you use the term, obviously, of 7, that simply means a complete number. And it simply means whatever a person does and asks for your forgiveness, they're willing to repent and ask for your forgiveness, you forgive them, regardless of that. I thought that was a comment a while ago, but it sounded the same way the second time, so I think it's not. And so keep that in mind as this is the backdrop. And then he goes on, he talks about the mustard seed and keep in context the principle, the context here on the mustard seed. Does everybody would have in him the capacity to be able to produce just like a mustard seed does? Yes. Well, what hinders it? Us. That's it. Everybody has the germ within them, the capacity within them. And of course, if you don't have that germ or that capacity within you, then you're not accountable. You're not accountable. But most of us are accountable. It's down in there. And we simply have to use it. Now, that is the backdrop then for what we're going to be reading about right here. That's a whole lot of introduction. Sorry about that. It came to pass as he went to Jerusalem, he passed through the midst of Samaria and Galilee, and as he entered to a certain village, there met him 10 men that were lepers, which stood afar off. And they lifted up their voices and said, Master, Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. And when he saw them, he said unto them, Go show yourselves to the priest. And it came to pass as they went, they were cleansed. And one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back and with a loud voice glorified God, and fell down on his face at his feet, giving him thanks, and he was a Samaritan. And Jesus answering said, Where were there not then 10 cleansed? Where are the 9? There are not found they that returned to give him glory, save this stranger. And he said unto him, Arise, go thy way, thy faith hath made thee whole. All right? So there's another number of words that's going to stand out here. We're not going to have time to go through all the other passages or all the other slides I've got going with it. But there's an indication here, obviously, that this is not a stranger that they come upon, that they recognize Jesus as being one they've heard about, who was a great teacher, a person who had miraculous abilities. I mean, that's all been happening. It's not only eyewitness things that have transpired, but word of mouth. I mean, it'd be hard to keep something like that a secret. And so if here's individuals who are suffering with a disease for which there is no cure, then you would give special attention to the fact that there's a fellow running around in this area that has the ability to deal with diseases, as in eradicating them and getting rid of them entirely. And so it don't surprise us then that when they see Jesus, they recognize this is a fellow that can do something about that. And when he says, have mercy on us, how are we to take that? Are they concerned at this point in time with their spiritual condition? Probably not. But with what happens, that's going to come into play, don't you think? Well, sure it is. Which is what we're seeing these miracles for. You know, they were to confirm the fact that here's a fellow that's speaking from God, so we ought to pay attention to what he says, because ain't nobody can do stuff like this unless God's with them. Which is a proper conclusion to draw. And I would say that all accountable people could draw that conclusion. And we have instances in the New Testament where people drew that conclusion, but they rejected it because they wanted to keep their place. They wanted to make their same amount of money. They wanted their same position of power and prestige, even though miracles being performed. So it doesn't surprise us then. And it just so happens that the one that comes back and says thank you was what nationality-wise? A Samaritan, of all the people. Now, it'd be hard for us to even wrap our minds around how this stuck right into the regular Jews' mentality when you got heroes that are Samaritans. Of all the people, a Samaritan is the hero? Is this the only time the Samaritan is a hero? Can you remember any other time? How about that good Samaritan? We wouldn't even know his Samaritan except his first name's good. He's not the bad Samaritan. And that's not to say that all Samaritans were noble and all that. But remember that woman at the well? She obviously wasn't good in the sense she had all these guys that had husbands, and she was living with a guy that wasn't her husband, John chapter 4. But she did some good stuff, even though so she's sort of like a hero. But to say that here's a Samaritan that's a hero would cut right at the biased, bigoted heart of a regular Jew. It can't be so. It'd be like giving the Medal of Honor to Putin or something, You can't do that. Even if he deserved it. If something changed and he deserved it. You just couldn't get over it. Couldn't happen. And so here's all these 10 that need to be cleansed, and they are cleansed. Now, keep this in mind too. And this goes with a principle that we'll see played out over and over and over in all of these cases of miracles throughout our study here. Remember on one occasion, this simply drawing our mind to it in Matthew chapter 20, where James and John, it's getting near the time where they're fixing to go to Jerusalem, Jesus is going to be killed, they're going to be scattered, and all that's going to happen. And so the mentality and the aspirations of some of the apostles comes to the forefront. That happens in the form here in this occasion of of James and John, and their mother comes petitioning the Lord that when he comes in his kingdom, which they still think is going to be an earthly empire, and the place of authority will be right there on David's throne, the city of Jerusalem, a physical kingdom, she wants special treatment for her 2 sons. And the message, to condense it down, the message that Jesus provides is what? All right, that's not the way it is. You've missed it. And by this time, we're already going on 3 years that they've been traveling with Jesus, listening to him, observing what he's saying and all. But yet they still are not catching on to the fact that that's the very opposite of the way God's things work. And he uses himself as an example of that being the case. He says, do you have the ability to face what I face? Do you have the ability to be baptized with the baptism that I'm to be baptized with? And he's obviously not talking about water baptism. He's talking about the overwhelming of grief and pain that he's going to face on the cross. Are you willing to do that? Can you handle that? Could you hold up under such terrible punishment? They said, yeah, we can do it. Well, of course they couldn't. Now, after the resurrection, yeah, they can and they will. But at this point in time, they ain't got it yet. They don't comprehend it yet. And in God's way of looking at things, the person who is the greatest is not the person that has the most slaves, the most servants, but it's the one who is the servant to the most people. Backwards. And of course, Jesus, not only on this occasion, but all the way back, remember in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 6, that's what Gentiles seek. That's what heathens think about. That's what people who are all caught up in, do you know who I am? Have to say. But that's not the way it is in the kingdom. And Jesus used himself as the example. He says, the Son of Man didn't come to be ministered unto, but to minister, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So when he says here in verse 26, it shall not be so among you. Whosoever be great among you, let him be your minister. And whosoever be chief among you, let him be your servant. Even as Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister, to give his life for many. So the way up is down. And so when you see Jesus in interaction with anybody, then that's his motivation. You see, that's what he's willing to do. And on this occasion, he came to be a servant. And on this particular miracle here, what kind of service is Jesus going to perform? He's going to be a physical doctor. What are you going to do? He's going to provide a help for what these guys need, what they want, what they desire. He's going to provide them with assistance. His service in this issue, of course it's not always that the case, but here it's healing them. He's giving them something they can't buy. They can't find it. It doesn't matter how good of insurance they've got, they're still stuck with leprosy. And Jesus has the only means available to give them what they need and what they want. And that's good health. What would you call that in a general way? Overriding principle. Sound like grace to me, doesn't it? Give something to somebody they don't deserve. But that they deserve? I mean, of all the people that had leprosy, do they deserve it better than anybody else? No. It's a free gift. And he's doing it to make a point. And of course, that's the point of the miracles. Here's the point. You better pay attention to this guy. I mean, there's wonderful benefits that are available to us physical-wise, but those are minuscule compared to what benefits are available spiritually speaking. We don't even have to fear death. I mean, how could anything be better than that? The medicine of that day could do nothing for them. Jesus had to heal them. And you would have thought, obviously, and we would have thought, if there was 10 guys that had leprosy and were cured of this incurable disease, don't you think that our estimation of how many people would jump and run back and say thank you would be more than 10%? I mean, I would think that, wouldn't you? I mean, maybe there's a couple of ungrateful snotheads, you know, but 9 of them? Of course, I don't think there's any percentage business here that we can draw about. But think about it. When it comes to what God, through His mercy, gives to us, not because we deserve it, not because we've earned it, but because He loves us in spite of ourselves, what's the percentage that are actually grateful to the degree that this man was grateful? I mean, would 10% be too much or too little? Something to think about it. Because we could put ourselves in the position of physically being benefited from that. I mean, if we had cancer, I guarantee if we had cancer and a doctor gave us a clean bill of health, no cancer, not now, not ever in the future, everybody we know would know the name of that doctor. And the families of everybody we know would know the name of that doctor, wouldn't they? Well, sure they would. If anybody had an inkling that they might have cancer, I guarantee you the first person they'd think of would be this doctor. The only one that never lost a case. And that's, of course, a sermon by Marshall Keeble, the doctor that never lost a case. And it's talking about Jesus. So, you can understand how clear this makes it, and why we might speculate that that's not the real percentages. In reality, it could be, sadly. And I hope that we are all in the 10% and not the 90%, for sure. And, of course, this comes as a principle, too, here, because not only these fellas come to Jesus saying and knowing He could have mercy on them and provide them with some kind of benefit to the terrible predicament they find themselves in, but when He tells them something to do, guess what they do? They do it. They do it. Now, you've got to give them credit for that. There's no indication here that they start making excuses like Naaman did, you know. Oh, have we not got better rivers down here than that old nasty, muddy Jordan River? We got 2 fine rivers right here in Damascus. We don't need... No, you don't see that. The simple request that Jesus gave them was what? Go do what? Go show yourself to the priest. Well, what's that got to do with anything? Well, the priests were the only ones who could make the announcement that they no longer had leprosy. Okay? So obviously there was something about the disease that was obvious to the eye, and various, if you go back to the book of Leviticus, then you see all the different ramifications that went into declaring such a thing as a person being capable of going out into in society without having to stand afar off, cover your head, and say, what did they say? I'm a leper, stay away from me, don't look at me, don't even get close to me. I mean, that was required because of how terrible this disease was. And so along with Jesus demonstrating the proper attitude, he also required everybody to do what he said do. And that's what he teaches. Jesus, remember, right there, we studied at the beginning in John chapter 2 last week, you know, what Jesus' mother had found out from that time before is whatever Jesus says do it. Well, that's a principle don't go out of existence. It's still that way. And so when he told these guys go show themselves to the priest, then they had to show themselves unto the priest. Now, it's Leviticus chapter 13, verse 45 and 46, and there's some previous applications in chapter 15 as well, as it relates to what you're supposed to do. And because this disease was communicable, and I know that it's like, just this past week, I heard some fellows talking in a setting, and they were talking about how that diphtheria used to kill tons of people. And what finally became something that we became aware of was that diphtheria came from living in filth. That was the way you got diphtheria. And of course, it was very contagious as well. And you didn't have to be the one living in filth. If you simply had a girlfriend who lived in filth, then you might get diphtheria yourself and it might kill you. But as things progressed throughout the 20th century, and people moved out of squalor and filth as a living mechanism, then by the time that they came up with a vaccine for it, there was only 400 cases of somebody dying from diphtheria the year before the vaccine was made. Okay? So it had taken care of itself. Much of what went on with the spread of this disease was because of close contact. Remember how the example of the law of Moses to the children of Israel, there were so many things that we look back on now and say, well, that's obvious. You know, you go outside of the camp and bury your waste. Well, you know, how do you think the plague killed so many people in Europe? You know, it's because people didn't understand basic hygiene, which was built into the law of Moses. If they just read the Bible, they'd figured out a whole lot of stuff. Don't sleep with rats. That's another one in there, you know. If you have a rat and you're spending the night with a rat, then don't be surprised if you catch the disease that rats carry. Something like that. Well, the same thing holds true for leprosy. And while there are leper colonies in the world today, there's different ways they can deal with it. That's distinguishable from the lack of that ability in the first century for sure. They were to holler, unclean, unclean. I didn't want to say that because I thought it sounded silly, but that is exactly what they'd have to cry. Unclean, unclean, stay away from me. And the priests were the only ones who had the ability to make the determination that they were in a position where they could then return to their family. And these 10 lonely men didn't question Jesus at all. They simply did what he told them to do, and they were completely healed. Now, how would this fit into the category of the context that we introduced at the very beginning? How would we, instead of taking all these little small things, the overriding principle here, going all the way back to the example that we mentioned a few minutes ago when Mary told the people who were willing to do the manual labor of getting the pots and filling them up with water and all that, whatever he says do it, is that ever going to change? You know, I've heard people say in a derogatory way, oh, y'all are just old commandment keepers. Well, let's see. You can be a commandment keeper or a commandment breaker. Which category you want to be in? You just believe in doing what God says do. Well, what's the other alternative? Not doing what God says do? Y'all are too picky and dotting all your I's and crossing all your T's. Well, what's the alternative to that? Should we apologize for taking seriously what God says for us to do?
We're going to stand before God and be judged one day.
Exactly. That's why I use the example in Luke chapter 6, verse 29. Thus did Noah, according to all that God commanded him, so did he. Now, what's that in there for? Is that just to make that chapter a verse longer? Or is it to establish a point that's already been made numerous times before? When God says something, just do it. That's the only common sense thing to do. You'd be a foolish individual say, well, I know God said that, but I believe this. Well, that's where the world is today. Well, I know that's what the Bible says, but I don't want to follow that. That's too hard. That makes too many demands on me. I won't be happy. Well, you've missed it entirely. The only happiness that's available for here in eternity is the life of a Christian. Yes, Charlie?
Yeah, Revelations 22:18 and 19 will cure that for us.
Exactly. If you're going to be adding and taking away from it, realize what you're adding and taking away from. You simply cannot do it. We have all things that pertain to the life and godliness that's been provided us through a knowledge of Him, that's Christ, who hath granted us glory and virtue. So that's where we need to place our emphasis and our hopes and our desires. Anything else? Was Jesus disappointed when all the men who were healed did not come back and show a thankful attitude? Well, of course. Do you feel bad if you do something good for somebody and they don't say nothing? Now, here's the thing. You don't do something good for somebody just so they'll say something bad. But it sure is nice when a response is coming in kind. Oh, you did that for me? Thank you. That's all right. There's the bell. Thank y'all so much, and we'll pick up on the next. I mean, look how much stuff I got going on here. Thank y'all. Thanks, sweetie.